Hey guys, I really hope you're having a wonderful day, or night, or whatever strange hour it is wherever you are in the world right now. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to talk about something that, let's be honest, is probably the reason many of you are even awake right now. We're talking about coffee, the dark, aromatic, slightly too hot liquid that humanity has been absolutely addicted to for centuries. When did people first start drinking it? Who discovered it? And how on earth did a small red fruit from the highlands of Africa end up in every kitchen, every office, every corner of the globe? That's exactly what we're going to find out. But first, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, if you enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing. It genuinely means the world to me, and it helps the channel grow more than you might think. And hey, drop a comment down below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? I am always blown away by how many of you are tuned in from all four corners of the globe. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about coffee. Chapter 1. The world before coffee, a civilization running on empty, in which humanity exists somehow, without its greatest invention. Picture this. You're a peasant farmer in medieval Europe. It is 5:30 in the morning, the sun has not yet risen. Your bed is a straw mat on a cold dirt floor. Your alarm clock is a rooster who, frankly, has no concept of the snooze button. You have to be in the fields before sunrise. You have a long and back-breaking day ahead of you, and you need something, anything, to jolt your exhausted body into some semblance of consciousness. So what do you reach for? Beer. You reach for beer. Weak, watery, barely alcoholic beer, but beer nonetheless. And not because medieval peasants were all hopeless alcoholics, though life being what it was, who could blame them, but because it was simply the safest thing to drink. Water, in most parts of the pre-modern world, was basically a biological hazard. Rivers and wells were contaminated with everything from animal waste to human waste to the runoff from the blacksmith's workshop down the lane. Drinking untreated water was an excellent way to contract dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, or any number of other conditions that would kill you before your next harvest. Beer, on the other hand, was boiled during the brewing process. It was safer. It was caloric. And in a world where food security was never guaranteed, those calories mattered enormously. So yes. For most of human history, the morning beverage of choice was essentially mild alcohol. The workday began with a small ale. Children drank it. Monks brewed it and drank it. Kings had fancier versions of it. Peasants had the grim, murky stuff at the bottom of the barrel, but everyone was drinking it, from the moment they woke up to the moment they went to sleep. And here's the thing about starting your day with alcohol, even weak alcohol. You are not exactly operating at peak cognitive performance. You are not solving equations. You're not composing symphonies. You're not making particularly great decisions. You're doing your best to stay upright and get the ploughing done before the sun sets, and that is about the extent of your ambitions. Now, this is not to say that the ancient and medieval world was entirely devoid of brilliance or innovation. Clearly it was not. Great empires rose and fell. Cathedrals were built, philosophy flourished. But there is something to be said for the idea that much of pre-coffee civilization was operating at something of a cognitive deficit, simply because the very first thing people consumed in the morning was mildly intoxicating. The ancient world had its own alternatives, of course. The Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks all had wine, lots and lots of wine, watered-down wine mostly, which again was safer than the local water supply, but still. The Chinese were drinking tea remarkably early. We'll come back to that. And various herbal infusions and decoctions had been used for medicinal and ritual purposes across dozens of cultures for thousands of years. But nothing had quite cracked the specific combination that coffee would eventually deliver. A hot, stimulating, non-alcoholic, shelf-stable drink that could be prepared relatively quickly and enjoyed at any time of day. That particular combination didn't exist yet. Humanity was running on a mixture of alcohol, herb water, and sheer stubborn necessity. And then, in the highlands of a distant and largely unknown land, a goat did something interesting. The sleep problem of ancient civilization. Before we get to the goat, and we will get to the goat, I promise, let's spend a moment understanding just how fundamental the problem of wakefulness was to human civilization. Sleep, as any modern neuroscientist will tell you, is not simply a passive state of unconsciousness. It is an active, complex biological process during which the brain consolidates memories, clears metabolic waste, repairs cellular damage, and basically performs all the maintenance tasks it can't get to while you're busy stumbling around being conscious. You need it. Desperately. And the amount of sleep the average human needs, somewhere in the range of 7 to 9 hours per night, is not negotiable. But here's the problem. The natural human sleep cycle, left to its own devices, does not particularly respect the demands of a productive society. For most of human prehistory, sleep patterns were governed entirely by light. When the sun went down, you slept. When it came up, you woke. This sounds perfectly reasonable until you realise that in many parts of the world, and in many seasons, when the sun goes down can mean 5 in the afternoon, and when it comes up means 6 in the morning. That's 13 hours of potential sleep right there, which is excessive even by the most generous standards. And yet even with all that potential rest time, ancient people were not necessarily well rested by modern definitions. Artificial light, in the form of fires, oil lamps, candles and torches, had been changing human sleep patterns for tens of thousands of years, gradually eating into the nighttime hours with the warm glow of firelight. The moment humanity discovered fire, the biological circadian rhythm started its long, slow negotiation with human ambition. By the time complex agricultural societies emerged, roughly 10,000 years ago, human beings were already pushing against the limits of their natural sleep cycles. There were crops to tend, animals to watch, enemies to guard against, bread to bake, children to manage, and an endless series of tasks that did not care what your pineal gland had to say about melatonin production. And then came cities, and then came trade, and then came religion, and politics, and armies, and libraries, and all of the extraordinarily demanding cognitive and physical work that comes with being part of a complex civilization. All of this on beer and water of dubious quality. The ancient world was, in many ways, chronically understimulated and overworked. It was waiting, though it didn't know it, for something to come along and change the game. The other stimulants, a brief survey of what humanity was getting high on. Now, it would be unfair to say that coffee was the first stimulant humanity ever discovered. That would be like saying the iPhone was the first device that could make phone calls. Technically accurate in a narrow sense, but wildly missing the point. Humans have always sought out substances that alter consciousness, sharpen the mind, ease fatigue, or simply make existence feel a little more bearable. It's practically a defining feature of the species. Give humanity a plant and about 15 minutes of unstructured time, and someone will figure out that you can eat it, smoke it, brew it, or rub it on a wound and see what happens. The most ancient and widespread stimulant in human history is almost certainly caffeine itself, just not in its coffee form. Tea, for instance, has been consumed in China for an almost unimaginably long time. The legendary Emperor Shen Nong, a quasi-mythological figure credited with teaching humanity about agriculture and medicine, is said to have discovered tea around 2737 BCE when, according to a charmingly specific legend, a few leaves from a wild Camellia sinensis tree fell into a pot of boiling water he was preparing. He tasted the resulting liquid. He was pleasantly surprised, and tea was born. Now, whether or not Shen Nong was a real person, whether or not this specific leaf-falling incident actually happened, the point is that tea was embedded deeply enough in Chinese culture that they attributed its discovery to one of their founding mythological figures. That tells you something about how important it was. Across the Pacific in Mesoamerica, the ancient cultures of the Olmec, Maya and Aztec civilizations had discovered the cacao tree and its remarkable properties. Cacao, the precursor to modern chocolate, contains both caffeine and theobromine, a milder stimulant. The Maya and Aztecs processed cacao into a drink called xocolatl. And before you start picturing a nice warm mug of hot chocolate, let me stop you right there. This was nothing like the creamy, sweet stuff in your grocery store. This was a thick, frothy, bitter, often spiced liquid that was consumed cold, sometimes mixed with maize flour or chili peppers, and was considered a ritual drink of enormous sacred significance. Cacao was literally used as currency among the Aztecs. Your morning coffee in ancient Mexico would have cost you actual beans of actual currency. Over in South America, indigenous cultures across the Andes had been chewing coca leaves, yes, those coca leaves, for thousands of years as a way of combating altitude sickness, suppressing hunger, and maintaining energy during grueling physical labour. The coca leaf, in its raw, chewed form, is a mild stimulant, far less intense than the refined derivatives that would come much later. it was a practical tool for survival in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. In North America and across much of the Northern Hemisphere, caffeinated plants of various kinds, ilex, Ethiopian holly, various native teas, were being brewed and consumed by indigenous cultures. Ethiopian holly, in particular, native to the southeastern United States, contains caffeine and was used by Native American tribes for centuries in ceremonial contexts. It is, somewhat bafflingly, the only caffeinated plant native to North America, and it is criminally underappreciated in the modern world. But that's a story for another day. And then there was khat, the leafy stimulant plant native to East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, which contains cathinone, a naturally occurring amphetamine-like compound. Khat had been chewed for its stimulating effects for centuries, possibly millennia, across the Horn of Africa and Yemen. And this is important for our story, because khat was being chewed in some of the very same regions where coffee would eventually be discovered and cultivated. The cultural familiarity with stimulant plants in this part of the world was not accidental. It set the stage for what was about to happen. The world, in short, was not waiting for a stimulant. It had plenty. What it was waiting for was the right one. The one that was easy to cultivate, easy to prepare, easy to trade, warm and comforting and deeply pleasant to drink, compatible with religious laws, and capable of reshaping the social fabric of entire civilizations. That stimulant was coffee, and it came from a very specific place, in a very specific time, in a very specific way that begins, as so many of history's greatest discoveries seem to, entirely by accident. Njakosti, the geography of a discovery, the Ethiopian highlands. You're no longer a medieval European peasant stumbling toward a barrel of weak ale. Now let's go somewhere entirely different. You're in the highlands of what is today Ethiopia, a landscape of breathtaking beauty and staggering ecological diversity. Here, at elevations ranging from 1,500 to 2,000 meters above sea level, the air is cool and thin and sharp. The terrain is a dramatic patchwork of deep ravines and broad plateaus, of dense highland forests and open savannas, of rivers that rush with startling urgency through valleys that feel like the beginning of the world. It is a landscape that has been inhabited by human beings for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, and the Ethiopian region was part of the ancient heartland of our species. The peoples of this land, the Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigray, and dozens of other groups, had been living in intimate relationship with this landscape for tens of thousands of years, and in the forests of this highland region, there grows a particular tree. It is not a spectacular tree as trees go. It reaches a height of perhaps 2 to 4 meters in the wild, though it can grow taller. Its leaves are dark, glossy, and oval-shaped. When it flowers, it produces small, white, star-shaped blossoms that smell quite lovely, a faintly jasmine-like scent. And then, following the flowers, it produces fruit. Small, round, glossy berries that begin green and gradually ripen to a deep, vivid red. These berries are called coffee cherries, and inside each one, nestled in a sweet, slightly mucilaginous pulp, are 2 small seeds. Those seeds are what we call coffee beans. The tree's scientific name is Coffea arabica, though in Ethiopia it simply grew wild in the forests, undomesticated, uncultivated, unnamed in any botanical Latin sense. The indigenous Oromo people called it by various names in their own language, bun or buna being among the most common, and they had been encountering this plant for a very long time. The question is, when did they start using it, and how? And this is where the story gets both fascinating and frustratingly murky. Because the origins of coffee, like the origins of so many of humanity's great discoveries, are not preserved in neatly organised historical records with dates and names and signed testimonials. They are preserved instead in oral tradition, in legend, in the accidental mentions of travellers and chroniclers, and in the physical evidence of botanical distribution patterns. What we do know, with reasonable scientific confidence, is this. Coffea arabica is native to the highland forests of southwestern Ethiopia, specifically the region historically known as Kaffa. The word coffee itself is almost certainly derived from this geographic name, though the exact etymological root is debated. We'll trace it in a moment. But the botanical evidence is unambiguous. The wild genetic diversity of coffee species is highest in the Ethiopian highlands, which is the clearest possible indicator that this is where the plant originated. The plant was here, in these forests, long before any human being thought to do anything interesting with it. And then, at some point, a point that historians can roughly place but not precisely pin, human beings started paying attention to it. La, the goat herder and the dancing goats, a legend. Worth telling you knew we'd get back to the goat. The most famous origin story for coffee, the one that gets told in coffee shop literature, on the backs of artisanal packaging, and in every introductory history of the beverage, is the legend of Kaldi the goat herder. Here's how it goes. Sometime in the 9th century CE, though some versions of the story push it back further, into the 6th or 7th century, there is a young Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi. He tends his goats in the highlands of the Kaffa region, and he knows their habits and their rhythms as well as he knows anything in the world. He can tell which goat is restless before it even moves. He knows when they are hungry, when they are content, when they are frightened. So on the day he notices something strange, it immediately gets his attention. His goats, having wandered to a particular part of the hillside, one he perhaps had not taken them to before, are behaving in a way he has never seen. They are not grazing contentedly. They are not lazily chewing cud. They are capering. They are leaping and prancing with a vigour that simply does not belong to goats in the late afternoon. They are, by every available metric, dancing. Kaldi watches his goats dance for what must be a very confusing period of time, and then he does what any reasonable person would do. He investigates. He looks at what they've been eating. He finds on a nearby tree small red berries, glossy and bright and abundant. Some of the berries have been partially eaten. The goats are going back for more with great enthusiasm. Curious, and either very brave or very foolish depending on how you look at it, Kaldi tries some himself, and here the legend diverges slightly depending on who's telling it. Some versions say he immediately felt a surge of energy and well-being. Others say he simply felt alert and awake in a way that surprised him. Some more colourful versions suggest he joined his goats in their capering, though we'll take that detail with appropriate scepticism. What he does next, in most tellings of the story, is bring the berries to a local Islamic monastery. He reports his observations to the monks there, that these berries seem to produce unusual wakefulness and energy. The monks, according to the legend, are initially sceptical. One version has them throwing the berries into a fire in disapproval, considering them the work of the devil. But as the berries roast in the flames, something wonderful happens. A rich, complex, devastatingly good aroma fills the air. The monks, entranced by the smell, rake the beans out of the fire and, experimenting further, dissolve them in hot water. They drink it, and they discover that they can stay awake through their long hours of evening prayer without the usual, very human temptation to simply close their eyes and drift off. Coffee, in this legend, is born. What's actually true about the Kaldi legend now? Is any of this true? The honest answer is, probably some of it, possibly none of it, and definitely not all of it. Kaldi, as a named individual, is almost certainly not a historical figure in the conventional sense. The story of Kaldi first appears in writing in a 1671 CE text by an Arabic author named Antoine Faustus Nyron, and Nyron is writing over 700 years after the events he's supposedly describing, with no cited sources, which is the historical equivalent of writing a newspaper report and citing your own imagination. The story does not appear in any earlier Arabic, Ethiopian or Persian manuscript that historians have been able to identify. This doesn't mean there is no kernel of truth in it. Origin stories and founding legends frequently encode real observations and real historical processes, even when the specific characters and events are entirely invented. The core observation embedded in the Kaldi legend, that animals eating coffee berries display unusual energy, is actually a real and documented phenomenon. Animals that consume coffee cherries do show signs of stimulation. This is not invented. Someone at some point almost certainly made this observation. Whether that someone was a goat herder named Kaldi in the 9th century, or 1,000 different unnamed people observing animals in the forests of Ethiopia over the course of centuries, is something we simply cannot know. The monastery detail is also plausible in a general sense. The connection between coffee and Islamic religious practice, specifically the need to stay awake during long periods of prayer and nighttime devotions, is very well documented in the later history of coffee, and is almost certainly a real factor in the drink's early adoption. Whether this specific story represents a real event or is simply a folk explanation for a connection that everyone already knew about is another question we can't definitively answer. What the Kaldi legend gives us, which is genuinely valuable, is a sense of how the Ethiopians themselves understood the origin of coffee's discovery, as something that came from the land, observed through the behaviour of animals, adopted first as raw berries, and then gradually processed into something drinkable. This general trajectory, from wild plant to deliberately cultivated and processed beverage, is consistent with what we know about the actual history of coffee's development. The truth, as it usually is probably less poetic than the legend and more interesting. Thirslam, the indigenous use of coffee. Before the brew, here is something that surprises many people when they first encounter it. The earliest uses of the coffee plant had absolutely nothing to do with brewing a hot beverage. In the highlands of Ethiopia and among the Oromo people, Coffea arabica was used in a variety of ways that predate, possibly by centuries, anything that we would recognise as making coffee. The most ancient form of coffee consumption we have reasonable evidence for is the eating of the coffee cherry itself, the whole fruit, pulp and all. The ripe cherries were sweet and contained enough caffeine in the seeds to produce a mild, stimulating effect. People who lived near the wild coffee forests would have eaten these cherries the way you or I might pick a handful of berries off a bush in the summer, casually, seasonally, as a treat or a snack. But there is an even more striking early preparation that historians believe may predate coffee as a beverage by a significant margin. In what is now the Kaffa and Oromo regions of Ethiopia, there is a traditional preparation in which coffee berries were ground up, seeds and pulp together, and mixed with animal fat, specifically clarified butter, to form a kind of energy paste or ball. These coffee fat balls were carried by warriors, traders and travellers as portable, calorie-dense, stimulant-rich provisions. They were the ancient equivalent of an energy bar. You'd eat one before a long journey or a battle, and the combination of the fats and the caffeine would give you a sustained release of energy that could last for hours. This is not a marginal or speculative claim. This preparation, sometimes called bun or described in various ethnobotanical records, is documented by multiple observers and is still practiced in some traditional communities in Ethiopia today. It is, by any reasonable measure, the original coffee product, not a drink, a food. The next phase in the evolution of coffee consumption involved brewing, but not in the way we'd recognise. Before the roasted bean infusion that we call coffee became standard, there were intermediate stages in which the leaves and the skin of the cherry were used to make teas and decoctions. In Yemen, which we'll come to in a moment as the crucial next stop in coffee's journey, a drink called quiche is still made today from the husks and dried skin of the coffee cherry, brewed with ginger. It predates roasted bean coffee in Yemen's history and is still consumed there as a distinct beverage. It is lighter, less intense, and quite delicious, for those who've had the opportunity. There is also the ancient Ethiopian preparation called buna kela, roasted coffee seeds eaten as a snack, not brewed, and kahwa in its original Yemeni formulation, which was initially made from the husks, not the beans. What all of this tells us is that coffee's journey from wild forest plant to the beverage we know today was a long, gradual process of experimentation and discovery. It didn't suddenly appear one day in a clay cup, fully formed. It was evolved, by countless anonymous hands over centuries, into the thing we now take for granted every morning. The pivotal moment in that evolution, the one that made coffee, was the discovery that roasting the seeds and then brewing them in hot water produced something extraordinary. And that discovery happened, or at least was first widely adopted, not in Ethiopia, but across the Red Sea in the Arabian Peninsula. Namd, the crossing. Coffee goes to Yemen. The Red Sea, at the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, is less than 30 kilometres wide. You can see across it on a clear day. For thousands of years, this narrow body of water was one of the most heavily trafficked maritime corridors in the world, connecting the trade networks of the Arabian Peninsula with those of the Horn of Africa. Goods, people, ideas, and, eventually says plants crossed back and forth with remarkable frequency. At some point, and historians have debated when, but most contemporary scholarship points to somewhere in the 14th or early 15th century CE, possibly earlier, coffee plants or coffee seeds made the crossing from Ethiopia to Yemen. The exact mechanism of this transfer is not recorded. It may have been deliberate. Yemeni traders or travellers encountering the plant in Ethiopia and bringing it home for cultivation. It may have been incidental, seeds transported in cargo or in the provisions of sailors. It may have happened gradually through a series of exchanges rather than in a single dramatic voyage. What we do know is that by the mid-15th century, coffee cultivation was firmly established in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, particularly in the region of Haraz in the Yemeni highlands. And it was in Yemen, specifically among the Sufi mystics of the Haraz region, that something transformative happened to coffee. The Sufis, for those unfamiliar, are a branch of Islamic mysticism that emphasizes direct personal experience of the divine through practices including prayer, fasting, music, poetry, and extended meditation. Among the Sufi orders, the hours between midnight and dawn were considered particularly sacred, a time when the veil between the human and the divine was thought to be at its thinnest, when prayers had the most power, when spiritual experience was most accessible. The problem, of course, was a very human one. Staying awake through the night is hard. The body wants to sleep, the eyelids become heavy, the mind drifts. You are a Sufi monk trying to maintain hours of concentrated devotion, and your own biology is fighting you every step of the way. Coffee, the Sufi monks discovered, was the answer. A Yemeni Sufi figure named Sheikh Omar is frequently cited in historical accounts as an early devotee of coffee, though the details of his story are, like Chaldees, tangled with legend. More reliably documented is the figure of Sheikh Muhammad ibn Sa'id al-Dabani, a Sufi leader associated with the port city of Mocha, yes, that Mocha, in the mid-15th century, who is credited in several contemporary accounts with recognizing and promoting coffee's value for religious practice. The specific preparation that the Yemeni Sufis developed, roasting the coffee beans over fire and then brewing them in hot water, represented a genuine innovation in the story of coffee. Roasting the green coffee bean transforms its chemistry dramatically. The heat triggers a cascade of Maillard reactions and caramelization processes that develop the hundreds of flavor compounds we associate with the smell and taste of coffee. It is, in a sense, the step that created coffee as we know it. Someone had to figure out that this was the right thing to do. Someone had to take a hard, green, bitter seed, throw it in a fire and think, yes, this is the direction we should go. That person or persons, whoever they were, unnamed and probably unaware of the magnitude of what they were doing, deserve a monument somewhere. By the late 15th century, roasted coffee brewed in hot water was being consumed regularly in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen. It kept monks awake during night prayers. It was shared, ritually and communally, in circles of devotion. And it was beginning, slowly but with gathering momentum, to spread beyond the monastery walls and into the wider Islamic world. The name, where does coffee come from? Before we follow coffee out of the Yemeni highlands and into the bustling marketplaces of the Islamic world, let's take a quick detour into linguistics, because the etymology of the word coffee is genuinely interesting and a little contested. There are three main candidate origins for the word, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is the most geographically straightforward, Kaffa, the historical kingdom and region in southwestern Ethiopia, where Coffea arabica grows wild. The argument goes that the plant's name in Arabic, kawa or variations thereof, derives from an Arabicized form of Kaffa. Kaffa to Kaffa to Kaffa to Kawa. It's a plausible phonetic journey. The second theory has nothing to do with geography. In classical Arabic, kawa is an older word that refers to a type of wine. Specifically, kawa was a word used in Arabic poetry to describe wine in a somewhat idealized rhapsodic context. The word carried connotations of something that was pleasurable, that suppressed appetite, that altered the drinker's state of being. When coffee arrived and began to be used in the Islamic world as a substitute for wine, which was, of course, forbidden under Islamic law, the transfer of the term kahwa from wine to coffee was, in this theory, a kind of rhetorical substitution. Coffee was the lawful kahwa, the prohibited pleasure replaced with a permitted one. The third theory connects to the Arabic root qhw, which relates to the idea of something that diminishes or dulls the appetite, which coffee, with its stimulant effects, certainly does. In all likelihood, the true etymology involves all three of these elements interacting. The word for the Ethiopian region may have influenced the term. The wine connection provided a ready-made cultural framework for understanding and talking about the new drink, and the description of its appetite-suppressing properties made the term feel apt and natural. From Arabic kahwa, the word moved into Turkish as kahve, which is why your Turkish coffee is called kahve. From Turkish, it passed into various European languages as they encountered the drink through trade: Italian café, French café, English coffee, German café, Dutch coffee. The word spread exactly as the drink did, outward from the Arabian Peninsula, carried by trade and travel, adapting slightly in each language it entered while remaining unmistakably recognizable. The word coffee is, in this sense, a linguistic fossil of coffee's journey. Every time you say it, you are, without knowing it, echoing a 700-year-old chain of cultural exchange that stretches back to the Ethiopian highlands and the Sufi monasteries of Yemen. Chakust, the Sufi experience. Coffee as spiritual technology. Let us return to Yemen. Let us sit for a moment in the atmosphere of a Sufi gathering in the late 15th century. The room is lit by oil lamps. It is past midnight. The air smells of incense and something else. Something rich and dark and warm, a smell that seems to thicken the air with complexity. Around a low table, or seated in a circle on mats, are perhaps a dozen robed men. Their eyes are open, alert, focused in a way that would be remarkable given the hour if you didn't know what they had been drinking. They are engaged in dhikr, the rhythmic meditative repetition of God's names and attributes, accompanied sometimes by music, sometimes by controlled breathing, designed to produce a state of heightened spiritual awareness. This is the practice that the Sufi masters have been refining for centuries. It requires sustained concentration, sustained wakefulness, sustained presence, and the small cups of dark liquid they have shared before beginning are, quite literally, making it possible. This is not a metaphor. The Sufi use of coffee was not recreational or casual. It was a deliberate, purposeful integration of a psychoactive substance into religious practice, understood, explicitly, as a tool for achieving a state of spiritual readiness. The coffee itself was sometimes thought of as having a kind of sacred character. There are accounts of Sufi gatherings in which the coffee ceremony was performed with specific prayers and invocations, in which the preparation and the distribution of coffee was itself a ritualized, meaningful act. This is important context for understanding why coffee spread so quickly and so deeply in the Islamic world. It wasn't just that coffee was a pleasant drink, or that it was a useful stimulant. It was that it entered human culture specifically through a religious context in which it was treated as sacred, in which its consumption was embedded in practices of community and devotion, in which drinking coffee together was not merely a physical act but a spiritual one. This gave coffee a gravity and a dignity that it might not have had if it had simply arrived as a product to be bought and sold in the marketplace. By the time it did arrive in the marketplace, it carried with it all of the cultural weight of its religious origins. And arrive in the marketplace it did. Because once a product is adopted by the most intellectually engaged, spiritually active, widely travelled segment of a culture, which, in the Islamic world of the 15th century, the Sufi orders very much were, it doesn't stay confined to monasteries for long. The end of Chapter 1, Coffee on the Move. By the end of the 15th century, coffee had completed the first major leg of its world historical journey. It had gone from wild forest plant in the Ethiopian highlands to a deliberately cultivated, processed and ritually consumed beverage in the Sufi monasteries of Yemen. It had acquired a name, a preparation method and a cultural significance that would carry it far beyond its origins. But here's something worth pausing on for a second, because it's easy to read this history and think of it as a kind of smooth, inevitable progression. Seed in the ground, plant grows, monks discover it, wonderful. But that's not quite how it happened. Coffee's spread was never inevitable. At every stage it faced resistance, skepticism, and, as we are about to see in spectacular detail, outright bans. People in power have always had a complicated relationship with coffee, for a reason that turns out to be entirely rational once you think about it. Coffee, at its core, does one specific thing above all others. It makes people more alert, and alert people, gathered together, in warm spaces, tend to talk. They tend to share opinions. They tend occasionally to criticize those in power. For the Sufi monasteries, this was not a problem. The monks were the ones in charge of the coffee, and the conversations they were having were about God. But the moment coffee left the monastery, The moment it entered the open marketplace, the public square, the bustling city street, it became something rather more dangerous than a devotional aid. It became a social lubricant for people who had previously had very few places to gather and talk freely. And that is where the real story begins. Chapter 2. The Cave Cane, the world's first coffee houses, in which a dark liquid creates the world's first social network, and the authorities are not pleased. You are in Mecca. The year is approximately 1511. You have just completed the Hajj, the great pilgrimage that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam and which draws hundreds of thousands of Muslims from across the known world to this single city every year. You're exhausted and spiritually transformed, and also, frankly, quite thirsty. The city around you is buzzing. Pilgrims from Egypt, from Persia, from the Ottoman territories, from East Africa, from Central Asia, people who have walked for weeks or months to be here, are everywhere. And increasingly, they're gathering in a new kind of place. It is not a mosque. It is not a market stall. It is not a caravanserai, the roadside inn where travellers traditionally rest. It is something new, a specific kind of establishment built around the consumption of a specific drink. The Arab world calls it a coffeehane, literally a coffee house. In Persian, the term is the same, and the institution it names is spreading with remarkable speed across the cities of the Islamic world. Inside, the atmosphere is unlike anything that existed before it. The space is typically furnished with low, cushioned seating, arranged around low tables. The air is warm and fragrant. Servers move through the room with small handleless cups, finjan, of dark, thick, intensely aromatic liquid. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, people are talking. They are playing chess and backgammon. They are reciting poetry. They are debating theology and philosophy and the price of spices in the market. They are doing business. They are gossiping. They are telling stories. They are listening to musicians and storytellers who have found in the coffee house an audience that will actually stay seated and pay attention. Because unlike a tavern, nobody here is drunk, and unlike a mosque, nobody is required to be reverent. The coffee house is, in the most literal sense possible, a new kind of public space, and it is filling a void that people didn't even know they had. The first coffee houses, Mecca, and the question of legality. The precise date and location of the first coffee house is, like so much of early coffee history, somewhat contested. What most historians agree on is that the institution emerged first in Yemen, almost certainly in the city of Olden, or in the broader Haraz region, sometime in the early to mid-15th century, as coffee moved out of the Sufi monasteries and into more general use. From Yemen, coffee houses spread north along the trade routes to Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest cities in Islam, and from there to Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Constantinople. The spread was rapid, strikingly, almost shockingly rapid. Within a few decades of the coffeehouse's emergence, there were hundreds of them in Cairo alone. Contemporary accounts from the 16th century describe streets lined with coffeehouses, with crowds spilling out onto the pavements. The demand was enormous and immediate, as if the coffeehouse had been a missing piece of the urban environment that everyone had been unconsciously waiting for. But it was also immediately controversial. In 1511, our opening date, the governor of Mecca, a man named Qayyar Beg, looked at what was happening in the coffeehouses of his city and did not like what he saw. He saw men gathering in unsupervised groups talking freely, potentially criticizing the authorities. He saw a social space outside the control of the mosque and the palace. He saw, with the anxiety, characteristic of people in positions of power throughout history, something he could not fully monitor or regulate. And so Qayyar Beg called a council of legal scholars, a fatwa council, and asked them to rule on the legality of coffee under Islamic law. This is one of history's genuinely remarkable moments. Because what it means is that coffee, a drink, was important enough, socially significant enough, and politically threatening enough, within just a few decades of its emergence as a public beverage, to require an official religious and legal ruling. It had gone from Sufi monastery to political emergency with breathtaking speed. The council deliberated. They raised several concerns. First, the pharmacological question. Did coffee intoxicate? And if so, was it prohibited under the Islamic ban on intoxicants? Second, the social question. Were the coffeehouses spaces of vice and sedition that should be closed on those grounds alone regardless of the drink itself? And third, and this is the one that gives you a sense of how seriously people were taking this, there were physicians called to testify about coffee's effects on the body, representing perhaps the first recorded instance of medical expert testimony in a legal proceeding about a beverage. Kaya Beg's council ultimately ruled in favour of a ban. Coffee was declared tentatively and not without dissent to be a potentially intoxicating substance, falling under the prohibition on khamr, alcohol. The coffeehouses of Mecca were ordered closed. Coffee beans were seized and publicly burned, one of the first great acts of coffee persecution in history, and decidedly not the last. The ban lasted approximately 1 year. The Sultan of Egypt, who was Kaya Beg's superior, overruled him. He liked coffee, his court liked coffee, and the popular demand in Mecca and across the region was simply too powerful to suppress. Kaya Beg himself was shortly thereafter removed from his position, though whether this was directly connected to the coffee debacle or the result of other political machinations, history does not say with certainty. The first attempt to ban coffee had failed. Coffee won. It would not be the last such battle. But the pattern was now established. Coffee would be threatened, banned, condemned, and accused of being everything from a religious abomination to a political conspiracy, and every single time coffee would win, because the people wanted it, and the people, it turns out, are very hard to argue with when what you're trying to take from them is their morning cup. Cairo, where coffee became a civilization. If Mecca was where coffee first faced its critics, Cairo was where it first truly flourished on a mass scale. By the mid-16th century, Cairo was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities on earth, the commercial and cultural heart of the Mamluk, and then the Ottoman-controlled Arab world. It was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, of scholars and merchants and artisans and soldiers, of mosques and markets and madrasas, of streets that smelled of spices and leather and bread and the river, and coffee. The historian Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, writing in the 1550s, produced what is one of the most important early documents in coffee history, a detailed account of coffee's origins and spread, titled Umdat al-Safwa fi Hil al-Kahwa, roughly, the argument in favour of the legitimacy of coffee. Al-Jaziri describes coffeehouses in Cairo in terms that make them sound less like simple beverage establishments, and more like the intellectual and social infrastructure of the city itself. People came to coffeehouses to conduct business. It was the preferred venue for commercial negotiations. They came to hear public readings of poetry and prose. They came to receive news, since coffeehouses functioned in the absence of newspapers as the primary nodes of information exchange in the city. A merchant who wanted to know what was happening in the spice markets of Alexandria, or what the Ottoman Sultan had decided about the latest tax policy, or whether a particular caravan had arrived safely in Damascus. He went to the coffeehouse and he asked. In this sense, the coffeehouse was not merely a place to drink coffee. It was the city's information network. It was the newspaper, the stock exchange, the public forum and the social club all combined into a single institution. And it was open, in principle, to any man who could pay for a cup. That last detail matters. The coffeehouse was, in the context of its time and place, a remarkably egalitarian space. Not perfectly egalitarian. Women were largely excluded from the public coffeehouse in most of the Islamic world, which is a significant caveat we should not gloss over. But among men, the coffeehouse cut across class lines in a way that was genuinely unusual. A craftsman and a merchant and a scholar might sit at adjacent tables, drinking the same coffee, and find themselves in conversation. The social barriers that structured most of medieval and early modern public life were, in the coffeehouse, somewhat softened. You could not buy a more comfortable chair by being richer. The coffee cost the same for everyone, and the conversation that followed, well, that was free. Chapter 3. Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire and its most controversial drink, in which an empire adopts a beverage, bans it, unbans it, bans it again, and eventually gives up entirely. You are in Constantinople. The year is 1554. The city around you is staggering in its scale and its energy. This is the capital of the Ottoman Empire at the absolute height of its power, the largest, wealthiest, most militarily formidable state in the world. The city sits at the junction of Europe and Asia, straddling the Bosphorus Strait like a colossus, and everything that matters in the known world seems to pass through it. Silk from China, spices from the Moluccas, grain from Egypt, wool from England, ideas from everywhere. The Grand Bazaar is a city within a city, 4,000 shops under a single vaulted roof, selling everything imaginable. The Topkapi Palace gleams on its promontory above the Golden Horn. The Blue Mosque does not yet exist, that comes later, but the Hagia Sophia, freshly converted from a Byzantine church into an imperial mosque, dominates the skyline with its extraordinary dome. And on one of the streets of this extraordinary city, two Syrian merchants named Shems and Hekim have just done something that will, over the course of the next century, change the social fabric of European civilization. They have opened a coffee house. The first coffee houses of Constantinople, Shems and Hakim, sometimes recorded as Hakam, came from the Syrian city of Aleppo, one of the great trading cities of the Ottoman Empire, and a place where coffee houses had already been established for some years. They brought with them not just the beans and the brewing knowledge, but a fully developed understanding of what a coffee house was supposed to be, a specific kind of social institution with its own architecture, its own rituals, its own clientele, its own purpose. The establishment they opened in the Constantinople neighbourhood of Tatakal, the commercial district near the Golden Horn waterfront, was by contemporary accounts immediately successful. People came, then more people came, then so many people came that the street outside was crowded. Within a few years there were dozens of coffee houses in Constantinople. Within a decade there were hundreds. By the end of the 16th century the Ottoman capital had somewhere in the region of 600 coffee houses, an almost incomprehensible number for a city that had had precisely 0 of them 50 years earlier. The Ottoman coffee house, the Kavahan, was in many ways similar to its Arab predecessors, warm, cushioned, fragrant, full of conversation, chess, backgammon, and the circulation of news and ideas. But in Constantinople it acquired some additional characteristics that reflected the particular culture of the Ottoman capital. The storytelling tradition, for instance, was particularly prominent in Ottoman coffee houses. Professional storytellers, Meda, would hold court in the coffee houses, performing elaborate narrative entertainments that could stretch over multiple evenings. Shadow puppetry, the Karagöz tradition, found some of its most important early venues in coffee houses. Musicians performed, poets recited, and all of this, always, over coffee. The coffee house also became a crucial node in the Ottoman information economy. In a city, without newspapers, the Ottoman Empire would not have a printing press in the Arabic script until 1727, nearly 3 centuries after Gutenberg. The coffee house was where you found out what was happening. Political appointments, military campaigns, market prices, scandals at court, shipping news from Alexandria, all of it circulated through the coffee houses, passed from mouth to ear, filtered and amplified and sometimes wildly distorted, but circulating nonetheless. This was enormously valuable, and for exactly that reason, it was also potentially dangerous. Murad IV and the most aggressive coffee ban in history. The Ottoman Empire's relationship with coffee was, to put it mildly, complicated. The drink was beloved by the population and by much of the court, but it was also repeatedly and energetically banned, more often and more violently than anywhere else in the Islamic world. The reasons were always the same, underneath whatever official justification was offered. Coffee houses were where people talked, and talking in an autocratic empire was a political act. Criticism of the Sultan circulated in coffee houses. Rumours spread there, conspiracies, real and imagined, were hatched there. Every time a sultan looked at his coffee houses, he saw not a pleasant social institution, but a network of uncontrolled speech, humming and chattering just beyond the reach of his surveillance apparatus. Several Ottoman sultans attempted to ban coffee in coffee houses at various points in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the most dramatic, the most terrifying, and the most ultimately futile attempt was that of Sultan Murad IV, who reigned from 1623 to 1640. Murad IV was not a man who did things by halves. He was one of the most absolute and personally brutal rulers in Ottoman history. A man who, according to contemporary accounts, would wander the streets of Constantinople at night in disguise, personally executing people he caught drinking wine or smoking tobacco, sometimes with his own hands. He had a sword. He knew how to use it. He was not joking. Coffee and tobacco, both enormously popular in the Ottoman Empire by this period, were banned under Murad IV on pain of death. Not a fine, not imprisonment, death. Let us be very clear about what this means. Under Murad IV's decrees, if you were caught drinking coffee in Constantinople, you could be executed. Coffee houses were closed. Those who continued to operate them risked, at the extreme end, being sewn into a leather bag and thrown into the Bosphorus. This was a real punishment that was really applied to real people during this period, and yet, here is the thing about coffee prohibition that Murad IV could not overcome, that Ka'ab Beg could not overcome, that no ruler in all of coffee's history has ever been able to overcome. People really want their coffee, with a passion that, in retrospect, is almost philosophically interesting. The desire for coffee, once established in a population, seems to be extraordinarily resistant to suppression, more resistant, apparently, than the fear of execution. Coffee houses closed publicly and operated privately. Coffee was consumed in homes, in back rooms, in places the authorities couldn't easily reach. The trade in coffee beans continued underground. People found ways. When Murad IV died in 1640s, the bans died with him. Coffee houses reopened. Coffee resumed its public, unashamed circulation through Ottoman society. And it was never seriously threatened again in the Ottoman Empire. Coffee had beaten the most aggressive anti-coffee campaign in the drink's history. The score: coffee, several; authoritarian rulers, 0. What the Ottomans did for coffee: refinement and ritual. It would be deeply unfair to define the Ottoman relationship with coffee entirely through its attempts at prohibition, because the Ottomans also did something extraordinarily important for coffee. They refined it into an art form. The Turkish method of coffee preparation, what we now call Turkish coffee, was developed and perfected in the Ottoman period, and it remains one of the most distinctive and carefully considered brewing methods in the world. The process is deceptively simple and technically demanding. Coffee beans are ground to an extremely fine powder, finer than any other brewing method, requires almost a flour-like consistency. This powder is placed in a small, long-handled brass or copper pot called a sezve, or ibrik in Arabic. Cold water is added, and importantly, sugar if desired, because in Turkish coffee you add the sugar during brewing, not after. The mixture is then placed over low heat and brought very slowly, very carefully, to a point just below boiling. The skill is in the temperature management. A good cup of Turkish coffee should develop a thick reddish-brown foam on its surface, the kapuk, without ever actually boiling. The moment it reaches a full boil, something is lost. The foam breaks, the flavour becomes harsh, the texture coarsens. The entire art of Turkish coffee is in holding the liquid at that precise point of maximum foam without tipping into the boil. Once brewed, the coffee is poured directly into a small cup, grounds and all, and allowed to settle for a moment before drinking. You drink it slowly, carefully, stopping before you reach the sediment at the bottom. The grounds that remain are sometimes used for fortune-telling, reading the patterns left by the dried grounds in a practice called tasseography, which is still practiced in Turkey and across the Middle East today. This is not merely a method of making a drink, it is a ceremony. It communicates care, attention, and hospitality. In Ottoman culture, offering someone a well-made cup of Turkish coffee was a profound act of welcome. The quality of your coffee making reflected on your character as a host. There were specific rituals around when coffee was served, and to whom, in some contexts, a bride's coffee-making skills were assessed by her prospective in-laws as part of the courtship process. Coffee was woven into the fabric of social life with extraordinary thoroughness. The Ottomans also gave the world something else, something that would turn out to be historically crucial: the coffee trade infrastructure. The port of Mocha in Yemen, already important, became, under Ottoman trade networks, one of the most significant commodity ports in the world. For roughly a century and a half, from the mid-16th to the early 17th century, the Ottomans had something close to a monopoly on the global coffee trade, because all of the coffee that the world could obtain had to pass through Yemeni and Ottoman-controlled ports. They were aware of this monopoly, and they worked to protect it. The export of live coffee plants or fertile unroasted coffee seeds from Yemen was, at various points in this period, explicitly prohibited by Ottoman authorities. The logic was clear. If coffee could only be grown in Yemen, it could only be traded through Ottoman ports, and the revenue would flow accordingly. Coffee was, in the language of modern economics, a strategic commodity. The Ottomans intended to keep it that way. They were, in the end, unsuccessful. But the story of how the coffee monopoly was broken, the story of how coffee escaped from the Arabian Peninsula and began its journey to becoming a truly global crop, is one of the most audacious acts of botanical espionage in history. But that story belongs to the next chapter. First, we need to cross the Mediterranean. Chapter 4. Europe wakes up. Coffee arrives on the continent, in which a continent that has been drunk since the fall of Rome discovers sobriety and is briefly horrified by it. You are in Venice. The year is 1600. Venice is, at this moment in history, the undisputed queen of European trade. The city through which the goods of the East enter Europe, the city whose merchant fleets have for centuries maintained the commercial connections between the Christian West and the Islamic East. Venetian merchants know the markets of Alexandria and Constantinople as well as they know their own Rialto. They have seen things that other Europeans have not, and some of them have seen coffee. Reports of the strange dark beverage had been filtering into Europe for decades by this point. Travellers' accounts described it. Diplomats mentioned it in dispatches. The Venetian ambassador to the Ottoman court had reported on the remarkable drink that the Turks consumed with such evident enthusiasm. But for most Europeans, these reports were curiosities. Interesting, perhaps, but not particularly urgent. That was about to change. The first documented sale of coffee to the European public, not just to diplomatic circles or wealthy collectors of exotic curiosities, is generally attributed to Venetian merchants in the very early 17th century. The exact date is uncertain, but by 1600 or shortly thereafter, coffee was being sold on the streets of Venice, and by 1645 Venice had its first coffee house. From Venice, coffee moved outward through Europe with a speed that tells you everything about how ready the continent was for it. Europe before coffee, the alcohol problem at scale. To understand why coffee hit Europe the way it did, you need to understand what Europe was drinking before it arrived. The answer, in most of northern and central Europe, was still largely what it had been for centuries: ale, beer, and, for those who could afford it, wine. The great beer cultures of Germany, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands were already well established. Spirits, gin, brandy, whiskey were becoming increasingly available and increasingly destructive over the course of the 17th century. And the thing about a society that runs primarily on alcohol is that its collective cognitive baseline is depressed. Not dramatically, not visibly in any single individual, but systemically, across the whole population. People were, quite literally, slightly drunk for most of their waking lives. The small beer consumed at breakfast, the ale with lunch, the tavern visit in the evening, it added up. Then coffee arrived, and something remarkable happened. The people who switched from beer and ale to coffee, and there were quickly many of them, were suddenly more alert. They were thinking more clearly, they were more productive. They could work more precisely, concentrate more deeply, sustain attention for longer periods. The historian Tom Standage, in his wonderful book on the history of beverages, argues that the arrival of coffee in Europe functioned like a sobriety upgrade for the entire continent. He describes it as a shift from a population running below its cognitive baseline because of constant low-level alcohol consumption to a population running at or above it. The implications of this were profound, and they showed up with remarkable speed in exactly the sectors of European society where precision thinking mattered most. Thus, the first English coffee houses, Oxford and London Coffee, reached England with almost comic abruptness. In 1637, a Turkish student at Balliol College, Oxford, recorded in some accounts as a Cretan student named Nathaniel Konopios, is said to have introduced coffee to the university, reportedly astonishing his fellow students by drinking it every morning. Whether or not this specific anecdote is accurate in every detail, coffee was certainly circulating in Oxford academic circles by the late 1630s. In 1650, a man named Jacob, possibly of Jewish or Lebanese origin, the records are frustratingly vague, opened what is generally considered the first coffee house in England on the High Street in Oxford. It was called, with minimal imagination, the Angel. Students and academics came, they drank coffee, they talked. 2 years later, in 1652, a Greek man named Pasqua Rosei opened the first coffee house in London in a churchyard in the city. Rosei had learned about coffee while working as a servant to a British Levant merchant in Constantinople, and he brought the drink, the knowledge, and the entrepreneurial initiative back to London with him. The response was immediate and overwhelming. London, at this period, was one of the fastest growing cities in Europe. a place of enormous commercial energy, intellectual ferment, and social complexity. It was also a city with a serious alcohol problem. The gin craze, which would reach its nadir a few decades later, was already beginning. Taverns were everywhere. Drunkenness was endemic. The social and economic costs were significant. Coffee offered something the tavern did not. A place where you could spend hours in conversation, conduct business, read the latest news pamphlets, and engage with interesting people, all while remaining entirely, usefully sober. The appeal was enormous. Within a few decades of Pasqua Rosé's first establishment, London had, by various contemporary estimates, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 coffee houses. This is an extraordinary number for a city of roughly 500,000 people, and it tells you how profoundly the coffee house had embedded itself in London's social infrastructure. The penny university, what London's coffee houses actually were. The London coffee houses of the late 17th and early 18th centuries deserve their reputation as one of the most remarkable social institutions in Western history because what they were was genuinely unprecedented. The admission fee to most coffee houses was 1 penny, the price of a cup of coffee. For that penny you gained access not just to a beverage but to the newspapers and pamphlets that most coffee houses kept available for patrons to read, to the conversation of whoever happened to be there that day, and to the information and connections that those conversations might yield. This is why contemporaries called them penny universities. For the price of a penny, you could receive an education available nowhere else. And here is the thing about the penny. It was genuinely accessible. Not to the very poorest Londoners, perhaps, but to artisans, clerks, shopkeepers, students, writers, merchants, the broad working and middle population of the city. These were people who could not afford university education, who had no access to the private libraries of the wealthy, who had no formal mechanism for participating in the intellectual and commercial life of the city. The coffee house gave them one. Different coffee houses developed specific clienteles and specific characters. Lloyd's Coffee House, established around 1686 by Edward Lloyd, became the gathering place for sailors, merchants, and ship owners who wanted to discuss shipping news and, critically, to arrange maritime insurance. The informal agreements made over coffee at Lloyd's eventually formalised into Lloyd's of London, one of the most important insurance markets in the world. It still operates today. The connection to coffee is now purely historical, but it's there. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley became the gathering place for stock traders, and the conversations and transactions that took place there over coffee cups eventually evolved into the London Stock Exchange. Again, one of the most important financial institutions on earth, with its roots in a coffee house. Will's Coffee House in Covent Garden was the literary coffee house, where the poet John Dryden held court, and where the leading writers and critics of Restoration England gathered to argue about literature. The essayists Joseph Addison and Richard Steele frequented Button's Coffee House nearby, and the conversations they had there directly informed the creation of The Spectator and The Tatler, periodicals that essentially invented modern literary journalism. The Royal Society, the scientific institution that remains one of the world's most prestigious, grew from informal gatherings of natural philosophers, many of which took place in Oxford and London coffee houses in the 1650s and 1660s. Robert Boyle, Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, the great figures of the early scientific revolution, were coffee house regulars. The ideas they exchanged over coffee contributed directly to the development of modern science. This is not an accident or a coincidence. It is a pattern. The coffee house created a specific kind of social environment, warm, stimulating, information-rich, accessible, sober, open to a relatively wide range of participants, that was uniquely suited to the exchange of ideas. Ideas that, in the coffeehouse environment, could be tested, challenged, refined, and combined with other ideas in ways that the more hierarchical, more restricted social spaces of the time did not permit. The coffeehouse was, in a very real sense, a cognitive accelerator for European civilization, and it was powered by coffee. Charles II tries to ban coffeehouses and fails immediately, because it would not be a complete history of coffee without another failed ban. Let us pause to appreciate the magnificent political disaster that was King Charles II's attempt to suppress the English coffeehouses in 1675. Charles II, who had been restored to the English throne in 1660 after the interregnum, was well aware of what was being said about him and his court in London's coffeehouses. Contemporary accounts make clear that political satire, criticism of the king's mistresses, commentary on his foreign policy, and general Republican grumbling were all standard coffeehouse conversational fare. Charles could not walk into a coffeehouse himself, or at least not without elaborate disguise, to monitor what was being said. But his agents could, and their reports presumably made for uncomfortable reading. In December 1675, Charles issued a royal proclamation. The coffeehouses were to be suppressed. They were, the proclamation stated, places where divers false, malicious and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government. They were to be closed within 11 days. The response from the public was immediate and volcanic. The outrage was so intense, the petitions so numerous, the protests so widespread, the political cost so obvious, that the proclamation was withdrawn within 11 days of its issuance. The coffeehouses never closed. The ban was, start to finish, an almost perfectly symmetrical failure. Charles II, one of the more politically canny monarchs of the 17th century, read the room and backed down. Coffee, yet again, had beaten the government. It would become something of a tradition. The French Café, a different kind of revolution. Coffee arrived in France somewhat later than in England, but when it did, it arrived with characteristic French thoroughness and transformed itself into something that remains one of the most recognisable cultural institutions on earth, the café. The first coffee house in Paris, the Café de Procope, opened in 1686, established by a Sicilian entrepreneur named Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli. Procopio had an instinct for what the Parisian public wanted that was genuinely ahead of its time. He created not merely a place to drink coffee, but an atmosphere, elegant, sophisticated, lit by chandeliers, floored with marble, furnished with mirrors and velvet. It was, in other words, a cafe in the sense we would recognise today, a place where the experience of being there was as important as what you were consuming. The Café de Procope became, and remained for decades, one of the most intellectually important establishments in Europe. Its clientele over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries reads like a greatest hits compilation of the French Enlightenment. Voltaire was a regular, reportedly drinking enormous quantities of coffee every day, a habit his doctor apparently warned him about, and which he allegedly dismissed with the observation that he had been poisoning himself with it for decades, and didn't seem dead yet. Rousseau came, Diderot came, and worked on his encyclopédie there. Benjamin Franklin, during his years in Paris, was a frequent visitor, and in the years leading up to and during the French Revolution, the café was where revolutionary ideas were debated, refined and radicalised. On July 12, 1789, 2 days before the storming of the Bastille, the journalist and revolutionary agitator Camille Desmoulins leapt onto a table outside a Palais Royal café, drew a pistol and delivered the speech that helped ignite the insurrection. He did it outside a café. This is not incidental. The café was where the people gathered. It was where you went when you wanted to find the most politically engaged, most conversationally active, most emotionally heated citizens. Coffee was at the centre of the French Revolution. It didn't cause the revolution, there were some more significant structural factors at play, but it created and sustained the social spaces where revolutionary thinking grew. This is coffee's superpower, and it operated identically across every culture it entered. It created a new kind of public space, and new kinds of public spaces always change what is possible in a society. Chapter 5. The Great Escape. How Coffee Conquered the Tropics, in which a single smuggled plant changes the agricultural map of the world. Remember the Ottoman monopoly on coffee? For much of the 16th and early 17th centuries, the Ottomans and the Yemeni authorities worked to ensure that coffee could only come from one place, the port of Mocha, through their controlled trade networks. The export of viable coffee plants that could actually be grown elsewhere, was prohibited. Every bean that left Yemen was carefully processed to ensure it could not germinate. The monopoly seemed secure, it was not. The first serious breach came, as so many important moments in the history of global trade do, from the subcontinent. Around 1600, an Indian Muslim pilgrim named Baba Budan completed the Hajj in Mecca and, on his return journey, did something remarkable. He smuggled 7 coffee seeds, viable coffee seeds, not roasted, not processed into sterility, out of Yemen by strapping them to his body. 7 seeds, sewn under his robes, hidden from the inspectors who checked outgoing cargo. Baba Budan carried those 7 seeds back to the Chikmagalur district of what is now Karnataka in southern India and planted them in the hills there. They grew, and the coffee plants that descended from those 7 seeds are the ancestors of the entire South Indian coffee industry, which today produces enormous quantities of the coffee consumed across Asia. A shrine to Baba Budan still stands in the hills of Chikmagalur. The hills themselves are named Baba Budan Giri, the hills of Baba Budan. He is remembered as a saint. He is also, depending on how you look at it, one of history's greatest agricultural spies. But the smuggling operation that truly ended the Yemeni monopoly for good came not from an individual pilgrim, but from the coordinated commercial ambitions of the greatest maritime trading empire of the 17th century, the Dutch. The Dutch and the botanical heist of the century. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, was, at its height in the mid-17th century, probably the most powerful commercial organisation in human history. Its capital dwarfed that of most sovereign states. Its fleet was enormous, its intelligence networks were extensive, and its hunger for monopoly commodities was frankly insatiable. The VOC had been trying to obtain viable coffee plants for years. They understood the commercial logic perfectly. Whoever controlled the production of coffee, not just its trade but its actual cultivation, would control the European market. And the European market was growing explosively. In 1616, Dutch traders managed to obtain a coffee plant, possibly through purchase, possibly through less legitimate means, the records are delicately vague, and brought it to Amsterdam. It was cultivated in the Amsterdam Botanical Garden, the Hortus Botanicus, where it was studied with great interest. The Dutch now had the plant. The question was where to grow it at scale. The answer, they decided, was their colonial territories in Asia. The island of Java, in what is today Indonesia, had the right climate, the right altitude, the right soil, and the Dutch, having established colonial control over Java through the VOC, had both the land and the labour force, tragically, a forced labour force, to cultivate it. Coffee cultivation in Java began in earnest around 1699. Within a few decades, Dutch Java was producing coffee in quantities sufficient not just to supply Europe, but to break the Yemeni monopoly entirely. The port of Mocha, which had been the centre of the global coffee trade for over a century, found itself increasingly irrelevant. Javanese coffee flooded the European market. Prices dropped. Consumption expanded. Coffee, which had been an expensive luxury for much of its European history, began its transition towards something that the middle classes, and eventually everyone, could afford. The word Java as a slang term for coffee, still used today in American English, dates from this period. It is a reminder of where so much of the world's coffee once came from, but the Dutch were not done. In 1714, the Dutch presented a coffee plant as a diplomatic gift to King Louis XIV of France. The plant was placed in the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris, the Jardin des Plantes, and carefully cultivated. A few years later, a young French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu asked to be given a cutting from this plant to take with him on his return voyage to the French Caribbean colony of Martinique. He was refused. He asked again. He was refused again. He eventually obtained a cutting anyway. The historical accounts disagree on whether he borrowed it with informal permission, borrowed it without any permission, or simply stole it outright. The French being French, the accounts are somewhat genteel on this point. Jusqu'à Gabriel de Clieu and the most dramatic sea voyage in coffee history. What happened next is one of the genuinely extraordinary stories of the age of exploration, and it is absolutely true. De Clieu set sail for Martinique in 1723 with his coffee, cutting in a glass case, a primitive greenhouse box designed to protect the plant during the voyage. What followed was a crossing of almost cinematic misfortune. First, there was a fellow passenger, described in de Clieu's own account as possibly a spy in the pay of the Dutch, who wished to prevent the French from establishing their own coffee cultivation, who attempted to sabotage the plant. He partially succeeded tearing off a branch before being restrained. Then there were storms, severe ones. The ship was battered for days. Then, becalmed in the doldrums, the ship ran dangerously low on water. The crew was rationed. De Clieu in his own account of the voyage, describes sharing his personal water ration with the coffee plant, giving the cutting water from his own daily allowance, going thirsty himself so the plant might live. Given that fresh water was the most precious commodity on a becalmed ship, this was not a casual sacrifice. Then there were pirates. The ship was attacked. It survived. After a crossing that had featured in rough order sabotage, storms, thirst and piracy, Gabriel de Clieu arrived in Martinique with his coffee cutting still alive, battered and somewhat reduced, but alive. He planted it. It grew. He guarded it zealously. By some accounts, he had it protected by guards at certain points, so aware was he of its value. Within 3 years, it was producing seeds. Within 50 years, the descendants of that single plant had spread across the French Caribbean and Central and South America, and coffee cultivation had been established across an enormous swathe of the tropical New World. De Clieu's cutting is the documented ancestor of the vast majority of coffee plants in Latin America. Brazil, Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, countries that today produce the majority of the world's coffee, can trace their industry, directly and verifiably, back to a single plant that a French naval officer kept alive on his personal water ration during a storm in the Atlantic Ocean in 1723. That is not a metaphor. That is literally what happened. Brazil, how coffee found its spiritual home. If de Clieu's cutting was the match, Brazil was the fuel. Coffee arrived in Brazil in 1727 through another act of calculated smuggling. A Portuguese colonial officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent to French Guiana, ostensibly to mediate a border dispute between the French and Dutch colonies, but actually to obtain coffee plants for Portuguese Brazil. The French, aware of the value of their coffee monopoly in South America, were not inclined to share. Palheta, according to the story that has been handed down, solved this problem through a remarkably direct diplomatic tactic. He seduced the wife of the French governor of Cayenne. When it came time for him to depart, she presented him with a bouquet of flowers. Hidden inside the bouquet were coffee seeds. Whether or not this story is entirely accurate in its romantic details, the historical core is real. Palheta returned to Brazil with viable coffee seeds, and they were planted in the state of Pará in the Amazon basin. From there, coffee cultivation spread southward with extraordinary speed, following the Brazilian interior toward the state of São Paulo and the Great Plateau of the interior, where conditions were absolutely ideal. By the mid-19th century, Brazil was producing 50% of the world's coffee. By the end of the 19th century, that figure had risen to 75%. Brazil had not merely entered the coffee market, it had become the coffee market. The scale of Brazilian coffee production was so enormous and so structurally important to the global economy that coffee prices in Rio de Janeiro set coffee prices everywhere. The fortunes of millions of people on multiple continents rose and fell with the Brazilian harvest. This dominance came at an appalling human cost. Brazilian coffee cultivation in the 19th century was built on slave labour. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans worked the coffee fazendas of São Paulo and Minas Gerais under conditions of extraordinary brutality. When Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, the coffee industry did not collapse, as planters had feared. Instead, it transitioned to a system of indentured labour, largely supplied by immigrants from Italy, Japan and elsewhere, which was exploitative in its own ways, but represented a grim step forward from chattel slavery. The history of coffee's global dominance cannot be told honestly without this part of the story. The cheap, abundant coffee that fueled the Industrial Revolution, that filled the coffee houses of London and Paris and Vienna, that kept the offices of the 19th century humming, much of it was produced by enslaved and brutally exploited people. The pleasure and the productivity that coffee delivered to one part of the world was, for a long time, inseparable from the suffering it created in another. This is not a comfortable fact. It is, however, a true one, and coffee's history is incomplete without it. Chakasi. The Arabica monopoly meets its challenger. Robusta. There is one more chapter in coffee's botanical conquest of the tropics, and it involves a discovery that changed the industry in the 20th century and remains controversial among coffee aficionados to this day. For the first 4 centuries of coffee's global spread, virtually all cultivated coffee was Coffea arabica, the original Ethiopian species, the one Baba Budan smuggled and de Clieu nearly died to deliver to Martinique. Arabica is wonderful, complex, aromatic, nuanced, capable of extraordinary flavour depth when grown under the right conditions. It is also relatively fragile. It grows best at high altitudes, requires specific temperatures, is vulnerable to a devastating fungal disease called coffee leaf rust, Himalaya vastatrix, and is not particularly tolerant of heat or humidity at lower elevations. In 1869, coffee leaf rust arrived in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and destroyed the island's coffee industry within 20 years. Ceylon went from being a major coffee producer to being essentially a tea producer. If you have ever wondered why the British drink tea rather than coffee, the answer involves a fungus. The solution to the rust problem came from another species entirely. In 1897, Belgian botanists working in the Congo identified a new coffee species, Coffea canephora, which we now call Robusta. Robusta is hardier than Arabica. It grows at lower altitudes, tolerates heat, resists disease including leaf rust, and produces significantly higher yields per plant. Its caffeine content is roughly twice that of Arabica. Its flavour, however, is distinctly more robust, more bitter, less nuanced, harsher. The coffee connoisseur's term for it is not always flattering, but Robusta made coffee cultivation possible in regions and climates where Arabica would not survive. Vietnam, which today is the second largest coffee producer in the world after Brazil, grows predominantly Robusta. Much of the coffee in your instant coffee jar or your budget espresso blend is Robusta. The tension between Arabica's quality and Robusta's practicality is one of the defining dynamics of the modern coffee industry, and it remains entirely unresolved. Both species are essential, neither is going away. Chapter 6: Vienna and the Coffeehouse Empire, in which a siege produces a beverage, and Central Europe is never the same. We cannot leave the story of coffee's European conquest without stopping in Vienna, because the Viennese coffeehouse is, by the estimation of many historians and essentially all Viennese people, the pinnacle of what the institution can be. The founding legend of the Viennese coffeehouse tradition is one of those stories that is probably slightly too good to be entirely true, but contains enough verified historical core that it is worth telling in full. The year is 1683. The Ottoman Empire, under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, has laid siege to Vienna, one of the most dramatic and consequential military confrontations in European history. 140,000 Ottoman troops surround the city. The defenders are vastly outnumbered. The Holy Roman Emperor has fled. The situation is, by any objective measure, quite desperate. Among the defenders is a Polish merchant and diplomat named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki, known in the German-speaking world as Georg Franz Kolschitsky. Kulczycki had spent years trading in the Ottoman world and spoke fluent Turkish and Arabic, which made him uniquely valuable as a spy and messenger. During the siege, he made at least 2 daring sorties through the Ottoman lines, disguised as a Turkish merchant, to coordinate with the relief forces gathering outside. The siege was ultimately broken on September the 12th, 1683, when the combined forces of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, led by the Polish King John III Sobieski, arrived and devastated the Ottoman army in one of the most decisive battles of the 17th century. In the aftermath, as the Ottoman forces retreated in chaos, they left behind an enormous amount of military equipment, supplies, and several hundred sacks of what the Viennese initially assumed were camel feed or some kind of grain. Dark, hard, strange-smelling little beans. The Viennese did not know what to do with them, but Kulczycki did. He recognized them immediately. He reportedly asked for and received the sacks of coffee as his reward for his services during the siege. He then did something that no one else in Vienna was in a position to do. He brewed the coffee. And not just that, he adapted it to Viennese tastes, filtering out the grounds, unlike Turkish coffee, which is drunk with the grounds in, sweetening it generously, and, in what may be his single greatest contribution to human civilization, adding milk. The filtered, sweetened, milk-enriched coffee that Kulczycki served in his Vienna coffeehouse, which he is said to have opened shortly after the siege using his supply of captured beans, was something genuinely new. It was neither Turkish coffee nor the plain black brew of the English coffeehouses. It was a local adaptation, softer, creamier, more indulgent, suited to Central European tastes. This is the origin, in legend and in rough historical reality, of the great Viennese coffee tradition. The melange, the verlängerte, the Einspänner, the fiaker, the entire taxonomy of coffee preparations that the Viennese would develop over the following centuries into something approaching a fine art. The Viennese coffee house as a way of life. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Viennese coffee house had evolved into something distinct from its English or French equivalents. Not just a place to drink coffee, but a way of inhabiting time. A specific philosophy of being in public. The Viennese coffee house expected, indeed welcomed, the customer who came not to rush through a drink and leave, but to sit, for hours, to read the newspapers that the establishment provided, and Viennese coffee houses prided themselves on maintaining enormous archives of newspapers from across Europe. To write, if you were a writer, to play chess, to think, to do absolutely nothing in particular in a warm, beautifully furnished room, attended by a waiter who would refill your glass of water without being asked, and would not present your bill until you requested it. Even if you had been sitting there since breakfast and it was now past dinner time. This was not considered strange or antisocial in Vienna. It was the entire point. The coffee house was an extension of the home, a place you belonged to, that you returned to day after day until the particular corner table you favoured became, in some meaningful social sense, yours. The literary and intellectual life of Vienna ran through its coffee houses with extraordinary intimacy. Sigmund Freud was a regular at the Café Landmann. Stefan Zweig wrote extensively about the coffee house as the intellectual centre of Viennese life. The artist of the Vienna Secession, Gustav Klimt among them, gathered and debated in coffee houses. The writers and thinkers of the young Vienna literary movement made the Café Grünsteidl their headquarters in the 1890s to such an extent that when it was demolished in 1897, the satirist Karl Kraus wrote a famous essay titled The Demolished Literature, arguing that with the coffee house went an entire cultural era. The Viennese coffee house was also, notably, one of the few public spaces in the Austro-Hungarian Empire where different classes, ethnicities, and political persuasions genuinely mixed. Poles and Czechs, Jews and Christians, socialists and conservatives, writers and businessmen, all sat in the same establishments, read the same papers, drank the same coffee. The coffee house was, in the fragmented mosaic of Habsburg society, one of the rare genuinely shared spaces, and it produced from this mixing an intellectual ferment of extraordinary richness. The late 19th and early 20th century Viennese coffee house scene, coffee in hand, newspapers spread across the table, conversation crackling across the marble surfaces, gave the world psychoanalysis, modern architecture, atonal music, logical positivism, and some of the most important literature of the modern age. Not bad for a beverage that started with a goat on a hillside in Ethiopia. The end of part 2, a world transformed. Stand back for a moment and look at what coffee has accomplished by the late 19th century. It has travelled from the wild forests of Ethiopia, across the Red Sea to the Sufi monasteries of Yemen, through the great cities of the Islamic world, across the Mediterranean to Venice, through England and France and Austria, across the Atlantic on the backs of smugglers and spies, and one very determined French naval officer, and into the soil of Brazil, Colombia, Java, India, and dozens of other places across the tropical world. It has along the way created the coffee house, an institution that changed the social architecture of cities on 3 continents. It has been banned, burned, condemned as devilish, declared a threat to public order, and subjected to the wrath of sultans and kings. It has won every single time. It has helped fuel the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the London financial markets, the great literary movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. It has kept Sufi monks awake in prayer, and Viennese novelists awake in thought, and we are not done. Because in the 20th century, coffee did something it had never done before. It became truly universal. Not just a drink of the wealthy, the intellectual, or the urban, a drink of everyone. That story, of instant coffee and espresso machines, of Starbucks and specialty roasters, of the third wave and the fourth wave and whatever comes next, is where we are going in our final chapter. The cup, as they say, is not yet empty. Chapter 7. The Industrial Revolution runs on coffee, in which factories, clocks and caffeine conspire to reshape the human relationship with time. You're in Manchester. The year is 1820. The city around you is barely recognizable as a city in any traditional sense. It is something new, something the world has never quite seen before. The air is thick with coal smoke. The sky, on most days, is a uniform grey-brown. The streets are crowded with a density of people that would have been inconceivable even a century earlier. Workers streaming toward mills and factories in numbers that seem to belong to an army rather than a neighbourhood. The noise is constant. The clatter of looms, the thud of steam engines, the shouts of overseers, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones. This is the Industrial Revolution at full roar, and it is, among other things, a revolution in time. For most of human history, work was governed by the rhythms of nature. You worked when there was light. You rested when there wasn't. Agricultural labour had its seasons, intensive periods of planting and harvest, punctuated by slower periods of maintenance and repair. Even in pre-industrial towns and cities, the pace of work was irregular, shaped by daylight, weather, feast days, and the particular demands of the craft. The factory changed all of that with brutal finality. The factory ran on clock time. The shift started at a specific hour and ended at a specific hour. The machines did not care whether it was winter or summer, whether you had slept poorly, whether your child was sick. The machines ran. You ran with them. The clock on the factory wall was not a suggestion. It was a command. And to meet that command, to be at a machine, alert and functional, at 5 or 6 in the morning, 6 days a week, for 12 or 14 hours at a stretch, the industrial workforce needed something that agricultural labourers, for all the hardship of their work, had not required in quite the same way. They needed to be reliably, consistently, predictably awake. Coffee in the industrial age stopped being primarily a social drink and became something more fundamental, a tool of labour. The factory workers' coffee break, which became institutionalised across industrial economies during the 19th and early 20th centuries, was not a luxury or a social ritual. It was a physiological intervention. A scheduled dose of caffeine, time to maintain alertness through the long grinding hours of industrial shift work. The coffee break is so deeply embedded in modern working culture that we rarely stop to think about what it actually is. It is a moment of chemically assisted recovery, engineered into the working day, because the demands of industrial production exceeded what the unassisted human body could comfortably sustain. Without coffee, the 14-hour factory shift becomes physiologically untenable for most people after the first 8 hours. With coffee, it becomes merely terrible. This was considered an acceptable trade-off. Coffee and the night shift, a new kind of human. The Industrial Revolution also did something that had never been done at scale before in human history. It put large numbers of people to work at night. Factories, unlike farms, could operate after dark. Gas lighting, and later electric lighting, made it possible to run machines through the night, maximising the return on expensive equipment. Night shifts became standard in textile mills, steelworks, chemical plants, and railways. Tens of thousands of workers were required to be awake, alert and productive during the hours when every biological signal their bodies were sending told them to sleep. Coffee was the answer. Not a perfect answer. No amount of caffeine fully compensates for the disruption of the circadian rhythm, as anyone who has ever worked nights will confirm with some feeling. But a partial answer, a functional answer, the answer that made the night economy possible on the scale that the Industrial Revolution required. This is, if you think about it, an extraordinary moment in the relationship between humanity and its own biology. For the first time in history, a large proportion of the workforce was being systematically used to override its own sleep signals, using a psychoactive substance in the service of industrial production. Coffee was the substance, the clock was the master, and the two together, caffeine and clock time, produced a new kind of human relationship with wakefulness that we have been living with ever since. The modern office worker who cannot function before their first cup, the nurse who relies on coffee to get through the night shift, the student who brews a pot at midnight before an exam. These are all participants in a pattern that was established, at industrial scale, in the factories and mills of 19th century Britain, Germany and America. Coffee didn't just fuel the Industrial Revolution. In a very real sense, it made the Industrial Revolution's demands on the human body survivable. The United States falls in love. From tea to coffee. No history of coffee's global triumph is complete without the story of how the United States became the world's largest coffee-consuming nation, a position it held for most of the 20th century. The American relationship with coffee is, at its origin, a political act of defiance. The Boston Tea Party of 1773, when American colonists protesting British taxation dumped an entire shipment of East India Company tea into Boston Harbour, was not merely a dramatic protest. It was a cultural statement. Tea, in the years that followed, became symbolically associated with British imperial rule, with taxation without representation, with the very thing Americans were fighting against. Drinking tea became, in certain patriotic circles, vaguely unpatriotic, and into that cultural vacuum coffee stepped. The shift from tea to coffee as America's default hot beverage happened gradually over the decades following the Revolution, but it happened thoroughly. By the early 19th century, coffee consumption in the young United States was rising steeply. By the Civil War era, coffee was so deeply embedded in American military and civilian life that it was issued as a standard ration to Union soldiers. Each soldier received a personal coffee grinder as part of their kit, and the ability to brew coffee in the field was considered a basic necessity rather than a luxury. Union soldiers drank extraordinary quantities of coffee. Contemporary accounts describe soldiers going into battle with their coffee cups still in hand. Officers reported that the morale impact of coffee shortages was severe, arguably comparable to ammunition shortages, at least in terms of the men's willingness to function. The Confederate forces, cut off from coffee supplies by the Union blockade, were reduced to brewing substitutes from chicory, acorns, and various other substances that tasted, by all accounts, absolutely dreadful. Some historians have half-seriously suggested that the Union's reliable coffee supply was a non-trivial factor in its eventual victory. After the Civil War, the American coffee industry expanded dramatically. Large-scale roasting companies emerged. Arbuckle Brothers in New York became one of the dominant forces in the late 19th century coffee market, selling pre-roasted coffee by the pound in paper bags in a form that ordinary households could use without owning a roaster. The commodification and democratization of coffee in America accelerated through the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, and by the early 20th century the United States was the undisputed center of global coffee consumption. Chapter 8: Instant Espresso and the Machines That Changed Everything, in which science attempts to improve on nature with mixed but commercially enormous results. The 20th century brought two technological innovations that transformed coffee more dramatically than anything since the discovery of roasting itself. They could not be more different from each other. One is an act of industrial convenience, the other an act of near-artisanal precision, and together they defined the century's coffee culture. They are instant coffee and espresso. Instant coffee, the miracle. No one quite loves the idea of instant coffee. Coffee that could be prepared by simply adding hot water to a powder, with no brewing time, no equipment, no skill, had an obvious appeal in an industrializing world that was increasingly obsessed with efficiency and convenience. Various inventors had been working towards something like instant coffee throughout the 19th century. A New Zealander named David Strang patented a soluble coffee process in 1890. An American chemist named Satoru Kato demonstrated a version of instant coffee at the Pan American Exposition in 1901. A Belgian-American inventor named George Constant Lewis Washington, a name that, if you invented it for a novel, would be dismissed as too on the nose, commercialized instant coffee and sold it under his own name starting around 1910. But the product that truly created the modern instant coffee market was Nescafé, launched by Nestlé in 1938. Nestlé had been approached by the Brazilian government, which, if you recall from Chapter 5, was producing enormous quantities of coffee and frequently facing market gluts, to develop a coffee product that could use up surplus beans. What they developed, after years of research, was a spray drying process that produced a stable, dissolvable coffee powder with a reasonably acceptable flavour. Nescafé launched in Switzerland in April 1938 and spread across Europe almost immediately. When the Second World War began the following year, instant coffee became a critical military logistics item. The United States Army adopted it as a standard ration. Millions of soldiers on every front drank Nescafé, or the American equivalent Nescafé's competitors, throughout the war. Wherever American and British soldiers went, they took their instant coffee with them, and when they came, Home, they brought the habit. The post-war boom in instant coffee was extraordinary. Through the 1950s and 1960s, instant coffee dominated the American market. It was modern, it was convenient, it was consistent. It fit perfectly into the post-war ideal of the efficient, time-saving kitchen. The percolator gave way to the instant jar. The ritual of brewing was replaced by the act of stirring, and the coffee got worse. This is the uncomfortable truth about instant coffee. The process of making it, particularly in the early decades, destroyed much of what made coffee interesting. The volatile aromatic compounds that give coffee its complexity and its beauty are precisely the ones most vulnerable to the heat and pressure involved in spray drying. What survived was caffeine, reliable, functional, effective, and a flat, slightly stale, somewhat bitter flavour that bore the relationship to great coffee that a photograph bears to the landscape it depicts. Recognisable, not the same thing. Millions of people drank it anyway for decades because it was what was available and because the caffeine worked. But somewhere, in the coffee-producing regions and in the minds of the people who remembered what coffee was supposed to taste like, a counter-movement was quietly brewing. Espresso, Italy's greatest contribution to civilization, fight us. While the Anglo-American world was enthusiastically embracing the convenience of instant coffee, Italy was going in a completely different direction. The espresso machine, the device that forces hot water under high pressure through finely ground, tightly packed coffee, was not invented all at once. It evolved through a series of Italian engineering innovations over the course of roughly a century, each one addressing the limitations of the previous approach. The earliest patents for high-pressure coffee machines date to the 1880s and 1890s in Italy and France. The fundamental insight that pressure could dramatically accelerate extraction and produce a more concentrated, more complex cup, was present from the beginning. But the early machines used steam pressure, which had significant limitations. The water temperature was too high, the pressure was inconsistent, and the resulting coffee, while fast, was often bitter and harsh. The breakthrough came in 1948, when a Milanese machine manufacturer named Achille Gaggia introduced a machine using a spring-powered piston rather than steam pressure. The piston allowed the barista to force water through the coffee at much higher pressure, 9 or more atmospheres, at a controlled temperature just below boiling. The result was something genuinely new, a small, intensely concentrated shot of coffee topped by a layer of reddish-brown foam called crema, produced in less than 30 seconds. This was espresso as we know it, and it was, in flavour terms, a revelation. The crema was the visible sign of the chemical transformation that high-pressure extraction produced. It contained emulsified oils that had never previously made it into a brewed cup. Oils that carried flavour compounds of extraordinary complexity and richness. The concentrated volume meant that those compounds were present in intense, immediate form. Espresso was not merely stronger than regular coffee. It was different, a different expression of the same bean, one that highlighted different aspects of the flavour profile. Italy embraced espresso with a total, unapologetic, slightly aggressive enthusiasm that Italians bring to things they are genuinely right about. The espresso bar became a fixture of Italian daily life with a speed that mirrored the coffeehouse revolutions of earlier centuries. Within a decade of Gaggia's machine, the espresso bar was the social infrastructure of Italian cities, the place where you stopped in the morning for your cafe, standing at the bar, drinking it in 30 seconds, paying your coin, and leaving. The Italian espresso ritual was designed for efficiency. No lingering, no seating, no enormous cups. Just the perfect small shot, consumed quickly, and then the day continued. From this espresso base, the Italians built an entire vocabulary of coffee drinks. The macchiato, espresso stained with a dash of milk. The cappuccino, espresso with steamed and frothed milk in equal thirds. The caffè latte, espresso with a larger proportion of steamed milk. The ristretto, an even shorter, more concentrated shot. The lungo, a more extended extraction. Each drink represented a specific, considered relationship between coffee and milk, between concentration and dilution, between intensity and approachability. This vocabulary spread beyond Italy's borders slowly at first, and then with tremendous speed once the right commercial vehicle appeared. Starbucks and the Americanization of espresso. The story of how espresso conquered America, and through America the world, runs directly through a specific moment in 1983, when a young marketing director at a small Seattle coffee company travelled to Italy, visited espresso bars in Milan and Verona, and had what he would later describe as a revelation. His name was Howard Schultz. The company was Starbucks, which at that point sold coffee beans and equipment, but did not operate cafes. Schultz's insight looking at the Italian espresso bar was that the experience, the ritual, the community, the particular quality of the drink could be transplanted to America, but only if it was adapted. The Italian espresso bar served 30-second standing drinks to commuters. Americans wanted to sit. They wanted larger drinks. They wanted, truth be told, more milk and more sugar. And they wanted a space that was neither home nor office, a third place, as Schultz would later describe it, drawing on the sociologist Ray Oldenburg's concept of the informal gathering spaces that make communities function. Starbucks, as reimagined by Schultz after he eventually bought the company in 1987, was the Italian espresso bar processed through American scale, American marketing, and American portion sizes. The cafe latte became the latte. The cappuccino survived with its name intact but expanded to a size that would make a Milanese barista quietly weep. New inventions, the frappuccino, the flavoured syrup, the seasonal limited edition drink, were added with the confidence of a company that understood that it was not selling coffee so much as selling a lifestyle and a ritual of comfort. By the mid-1990s, Starbucks was expanding at a rate of roughly one new store per day. By the 2000s, it was a global phenomenon, with locations in dozens of countries, making espresso-based drinks available and familiar to populations that had never encountered a macchiato before. The standardization was brutal. A Starbucks in Beijing tasted essentially the same as a Starbucks in Buenos Aires or Brussels, but the reach was unprecedented. Starbucks did something enormously important for coffee, even if the specialty coffee world finds it difficult to give them the credit. It educated an entire generation of consumers in espresso-based drinks. It created the demand, the language, and the habit. People who had grown up on instant coffee or drip machines now knew what a latte was, knew they liked milk-based espresso drinks, knew the difference between a cappuccino and a flat white. That education, however imperfect, however commercially motivated, prepared the ground for what came next. Chapter 9. The Third Wave: Coffee as Culture, Science and Obsession. In which humanity decides that a drink 500 years in the making deserves to be taken seriously. By the early 2000s, a movement was underway in coffee that was, in its own way, as significant as any of the previous revolutions in the drink's history. It didn't have a single founding moment or a single founding figure. It emerged simultaneously in small roasters and specialty cafes in cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Melbourne, Oslo, and London, places where a small but intensely committed group of people had decided that coffee was not merely a caffeine delivery mechanism or a lifestyle product, but something worthy of the same serious, rigorous attention that the best wine, cheese, or bread received. The people in this movement came to be called the Third Wave of Coffee, a term coined by the coffee professional Trish Rothgeb in a 2002 article. The first wave was the democratization of coffee, the Folgers and Maxwell House era of mass market availability. The second wave was the Starbucks era, the elevation of coffee into a lifestyle experience. The third wave was something different, a focus on coffee as an agricultural product, on the specific qualities of beans from specific farms, specific regions, specific harvest years, and on the craft of roasting and brewing those beans in ways that honoured rather than obscured those specific qualities. Third wave coffee introduced or radically popularised a series of ideas and practices that would have been incomprehensible to the average coffee drinker a generation earlier. Single origin coffee. The idea that coffee from a particular farm, a particular region, a particular country had a specific, identifiable, valuable flavour profile that was worth preserving and communicating to the drinker. Just as wine lovers discuss Burgundy versus Bordeaux, third wave coffee lovers began discussing Ethiopian Yirgacheffe versus Guatemalan Antigua, not as geography lessons but as flavour descriptions. Light roasting, a deliberate counter-movement against the dark French roast style that had dominated specialty coffee since the second wave. Dark roasting, third wave roasters argued, imposed the roaster's mark on the bean and destroyed the delicate origin-specific flavours that made single-origin coffee worth drinking. Light roasting preserved those flavours, fruity, floral, tea-like, wine-like notes that darker roasting converted into caramelized bitterness. The resulting cup was, to many traditionalists, startlingly unfamiliar. It tasted less like coffee in the conventional sense. It tasted more like the fruit that the coffee cherry once was. Brewing precision, the introduction of scientific rigor into the brewing process, scales to measure exact coffee-to-water ratios, gooseneck kettles to control water flow rate and direction, thermometers to monitor water temperature to the degree, timers to control extraction time to the second, refractometers to measure the concentration of dissolved coffee solids in the cup. Third-wave baristas approach brewing with the methodology of laboratory scientists, and they were not apologetic about it. Direct trade, a growing movement to establish direct commercial relationships between roasters and the farmers who grew their coffee, cutting out intermediaries and ensuring that more of the value of specialty coffee reached the people who actually produced it. This was partly ethical, a response to the long and uncomfortable history of exploitation in the coffee supply chain, and partly practical, since direct relationships allowed roasters to specify and verify the quality of the beans they were buying. The third wave transformed what a great cup of coffee could taste like, and it transformed what it meant to work in coffee. The barista in third wave culture was not a low-skill service worker, or not only that. The barista was a craftsperson with specialized knowledge, technical skill, and a genuine stake in the quality of the product. International barista competitions, the World Barista Championship, the World Brewers Cup emerged and attracted elite practitioners from across the globe. Coffee and science, what we actually know about what it does to you. At this point in our story, it seems appropriate to pause and address something that has been implicit in everything we've discussed, but never quite directly confronted. What does coffee actually do to the human body, and why does it work the way it does? The answer involves a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of cellular metabolism. It is produced in your brain as a natural consequence of the energy expenditure involved in thinking, perceiving, and being conscious. As adenosine accumulates over the course of the day, it binds to specific receptors in the brain that are associated with tiredness and the drive to sleep. The more adenosine accumulates, the more sleepy you feel. This is the physiological mechanism of what we experience as fatigue. Your brain is literally measuring its own exhaustion through the accumulation of this molecular byproduct. Caffeine works by fitting into the adenosine receptors without activating them. It is, in chemical terms, an adenosine antagonist. It blocks the receptors that adenosine would normally bind to, preventing the tiredness signal from being transmitted. The adenosine is still there, still accumulating. But your brain can't register it, because the receptors are occupied by caffeine molecules. This is why caffeine doesn't actually give you energy in any direct physiological sense. It doesn't add fuel, it removes the brake. It allows you to use the energy your body already has without receiving the fatigue signal that would normally tell you to slow down and rest. The consequences of this mechanism are important. When the caffeine eventually metabolizes and clears from your receptors, which takes several hours depending on your individual metabolism and liver enzyme activity, all of that adenosine that has been accumulating suddenly floods in and binds to the now available receptors simultaneously. This is why the caffeine crash hits harder than the tiredness you would have felt if you hadn't had coffee. You haven't avoided the fatigue, you've deferred it, and the deferred bill comes due all at once. Caffeine also stimulates the release of adrenaline and influences dopamine signaling, which explains the mood-elevating, energy-inducing feeling that accompanies a good cup of coffee. The dopamine effect, in particular, contributes to coffee's habitual appeal. The brain learns to associate the ritual of coffee consumption with the subsequent dopamine signal and begins to anticipate and crave that signal. You are, in the most literal neurochemical sense, addicted to coffee. This is not a moral judgment. Caffeine addiction, for most people in moderate doses, is a remarkably benign one, associated with far more health benefits than harms, as the considerable body of modern research on coffee consumption makes clear. Regular coffee consumption is associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, certain liver conditions, and several other health outcomes. The mechanisms are not fully understood, and coffee researchers are quick to note that correlation is not causation. But the evidence is consistent and substantial enough that most physicians regard moderate coffee consumption, defined as roughly 3 to 4 cups per day, as If not exactly health food, then certainly not harmful and possibly genuinely beneficial. The one area where coffee's health picture is somewhat more complicated involves sleep. Caffeine's half-life in the human body is roughly 5 to 7 hours, which means that a cup of coffee consumed at 3 in the afternoon still has half its caffeine load active in your system at 8 or 9 in the evening. This residual caffeine can significantly disrupt sleep quality, even in people who feel they have no problem falling asleep after afternoon coffee. Poor sleep quality, accumulated over time, has wide-ranging health consequences. The irony of coffee, that the substance we use to fight fatigue may, over the long term, be contributing to it, is one that the neuroscientist Matthew Walker has written about with considerable eloquence. Chapter 10. Coffee. Today and tomorrow, in which we arrive at the present moment, slightly over-caffeinated and entirely grateful. The world drinks today approximately 10 billion kilograms of coffee per year. Let that number sit for a moment. 10 billion kilograms, more than 400 billion cups. Roughly 1.5 cups for every person on Earth every single day, though of course the distribution is wildly uneven. Finland, the most coffee-intensive country on the planet per capita, consumes around 12 kilograms per person per year. The average Finnish adult drinks 4 to 5 cups a day, every day. Brazil remains the largest producer. Vietnam is second. Colombia, Indonesia, Ethiopia, which is, wonderfully, now also a significant exporter of the coffee that grew wild in its forests for millennia before anyone thought to brew it, complete the top 5. The global coffee industry is worth somewhere in the range of $100 billion annually, making it one of the most valuable agricultural commodities on Earth. And yet, coffee faces challenges in the 21st century that would have been unimaginable to the Sufi monks of Yemen or the merchants of Mocha. Climate change is, by the assessment of virtually every agricultural scientist who has studied the question, the most significant threat to coffee production in the coming decades. Coffea arabica is a climate-sensitive plant. It requires specific temperature ranges, specific rainfall patterns, specific seasonal variation. As global temperatures rise and weather patterns become more erratic, the areas of the world where Arabica coffee can be grown successfully are shifting, and, in some cases, shrinking. Some models project that by 2050, up to 50% of the land currently used for coffee cultivation may become unsuitable due to climate change. This is not an abstract or distant threat. It is already happening. Coffee farmers in Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala and Vietnam are already reporting changes in growing seasons, shifts in pest pressure, and crop losses associated with unusual weather. The altitude at which coffee can be successfully grown is creeping upward as lower altitude zones become too warm. In some regions, farmers are physically moving their crops higher up the mountain year by year, following the retreating band of suitable climate. The research response to this challenge is significant and ongoing. Plant scientists are investigating wild coffee species, many of them still found in the Ethiopian and Madagascan forests where the genus evolved, for genetic traits that confer greater heat tolerance, drought resistance, and disease resistance. Some of these wild species, which have never been commercially cultivated, may contain the genetic material needed to produce coffee varieties that can survive and thrive in the warmer world of the coming century. There is something poetically apt about this. The solution to coffee's 21st century crisis may lie in the forests of Ethiopia, the very place where the story began. The wild plants that Chaldee's goats may have danced under, that Baba Budan carefully selected his 7 seeds from, that have been growing undisturbed in the highland forest for millennia. Those plants may yet save the drink that has sustained human civilization for 500 years. The 4th wave and beyond, what coffee is becoming. If the 3rd wave was about quality, science and direct trade, the movement that some are beginning to call the 4th wave is about something harder to define, perhaps about integration. The integration of coffee knowledge into everyday life, the normalization of quality, the democratization of what the 3rd wave discovered. Home brewing equipment that would have required professional training to use a decade ago is now available and approachable to the motivated amateur. The AeroPress, the V60, the Chemex, the Mocha Pot, the home espresso machine. These are tools that a significant and growing proportion of coffee drinkers use at home with genuine skill and knowledge. Coffee has become, for many people, not just a daily habit but a genuine hobby, a domain of expertise, aesthetics, and craft that brings the same satisfaction as cooking, gardening, or any other applied art. Specialty coffee shops, which a decade ago were clustered in a handful of progressive cities, are now found in cities and towns across the world. The language of the third wave, single origin, light roast, tasting notes, has filtered into the mainstream. Supermarket coffee is better than it was. Chain coffee shop coffee is better than it was. The rising tide of quality, it turns out, lifts all boats, and coffee culture continues to evolve in ways that reflect the broader currents of contemporary society. The growth of specialty instant coffee, high-quality, freeze-dried or spray-dried versions of specialty-grade beans, represents an attempt to reconcile the third wave's quality focus with the demands of convenience. Cold brew coffee, steeped in cold water for 12 to 24 hours rather than brewed with heat, has gone from a niche curiosity to a mainstream product in less than a decade. Nitro coffee, cold brew infused with nitrogen gas, giving it a Guinness-like creaminess and texture, arrived from nowhere to become a standard offering in progressive cafes worldwide. Plant-based milks have transformed the milk-based espresso drink in ways that would have been inconceivable even 10 years ago. Oat milk in particular has emerged as a serious rival to dairy in coffee applications. Its fat composition and protein content produce a texture in steamed form that many baristas consider genuinely excellent, and its flavour is neutral enough not to compete with the coffee. The oat milk latte is, in many cities, as common as the traditional dairy version, and, somewhere, in a research lab in Singapore or Tel Aviv or Berkeley, scientists are working on questions about coffee that would have seemed like science fiction not long ago. Lab-grown coffee, produced from cell cultures without the need for land, water, or the complex agricultural systems of traditional cultivation, is in early development stages. Whether it will ever reach the quality or the cost point necessary for commercial viability is unclear. But that it is being seriously pursued is itself a sign of how central coffee has become to the global economy, and how seriously the threats to its traditional production are being taken. Conclusion. From a hillside in Ethiopia to your mug this morning. In which we come full circle. So, when did people start drinking coffee? The honest answer is, gradually, and then all at once. Gradually, over centuries of informal observation and experimentation, by the Oromo people of Ethiopia, who ate the cherries and made the energy balls and brewed the leaf teas long before anyone thought to roast a bean. Then in the Sufi monasteries of 15th century Yemen, where someone made the decisive leap of throwing those beans into a fire and brewing what came out. Then in the coffeehouses of Mecca and Cairo and Constantinople, where a social revolution disguised as a beverage began to reshape the Islamic world. Then across the Mediterranean to Venice, to London, to Paris, to Vienna, and all the way around the world via Java and Martinique and Brazil and Colombia, until there was no corner of the earth where coffee had not arrived and made itself at home. All at once, because once coffee arrived somewhere, it tended to become essential with remarkable speed. Once you have tasted it, once your brain has learned the adenosine trick, once you have sat in a warm room with a good cup and good conversation, it is very difficult to imagine life without it. Humanity has tried. Kings and sultans and governors and religious authorities have tried. They have burned the beans and closed the coffeehouses and issued proclamations under pain of death. Every single time, coffee won. Because the thing about coffee is that what it offers, warmth, alertness, community, the particular pleasure of a well-made cup, is something that human beings, once they have experienced it, are not willing to give up. We are, all of us, the inheritors of that 1500-year story. Every time you make a cup of coffee, whether it is a precisely measured pour-over in a specialty cafe, or a spoonful of instant stirred into hot water in a hurry, or a tiny cup of thick Turkish coffee consumed in 30 seconds at a bar in Istanbul, you are participating in something ancient and continuous and genuinely remarkable. The goat herder, the Sufi monks, the Yemeni traders, Baba Budan and his 7 seeds, Gabriel de Clieu on his storm-tossed ship, the students of Oxford arguing about natural philosophy, the Viennese writers nursing their cups through long afternoons, the factory workers of Manchester drinking their morning ration before the shift began, the baristas of Oslo and Melbourne grinding their single-origin beans with the focus of surgeons. They are all part of the same story. They are all in their different ways drinking the same drink, and now so are you. Thank you so much for watching. I genuinely hope you enjoyed this video. It was one of the most fascinating topics I've had the pleasure of researching, and I barely scratched the surface. If you want me to go deeper on any particular chapter of this story, the Ottoman coffeehouse bans, the botanical espionage in Java, the history of espresso, the science of caffeine, let me know in the comments and I'll put it on the list. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you know. And as always, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you having your morning coffee right now? Your afternoon pick-me-up? Are you watching this at 2 in the morning with a cup that you know you probably shouldn't be drinking? Either way, I hope it's a good one. I'll see you in the next video.